I'll pass it on now to Amrita and Dennis, and they're going to be talking tonight about what's bugging your garden. And I'm going to bring you those extra packets.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. So tonight's program is going to build on the other programs that we've given in the last few months. So if you haven't been to those programs, you can go to the library website and you can access, thanks to Berwick Community Media, videos of those classes. So that should help to bring you up to speed. And I think I have my email on the bottom of your note sheet. So if you watch those videos and you would like to have the same kind of handouts, just email me and I'll send them to you, okay? Great. So tonight we're going to talk about what's bugging your garden. And it could be a number of different things. It could be actual creepy crawly pests, it could be buzzing pests, it could be birds, it could be mammals, might be your neighbor, who knows. So the most important thing though in creating your garden is creating resilience. So resilience in a garden means the ability of plants to withstand some sort of onslaught, whether it's the weather, whether it's pests, it could be drift from somebody else's pesticides. Unfortunately, that happens. So if you follow some of the things that we've talked about, especially building the soil. Building the soil is really the most important thing. That's the thing that's going to give your plants the most resilience, is having really good quality soil, which means no tilling, which means you feed it from the top, not from underneath, and you cover it with some kind of mulch. Those are the most important things that really will keep your soil the healthiest. And another thing that we talked about in our last class is utilizing your garden superheroes. So if you missed that class, that's a really fun one to watch, because we actually created some pictures, some cartoons of superheroes, and they have specific jobs in the garden. So the superheroes that really will help make your garden more resilient to combat pests are confusers. And we'll talk about that as we go on tonight. Attractors, mulchers, and suppressors. Those are the most important ones. So let's move on. You can see all the little critters here. Some of them might be things that you like. Some of them might be things that you don't like in your garden. I can probably figure out which ones you don't like, but we'll talk about that. So making your garden resilient means making the environment unfriendly for the pests, and that's a really good way to manage them. So if your garden is too friendly to pests, they'll move right in and they'll be hard to get rid of. But we're going to talk about some ways to make it unfriendly for them without harming the environment, because that's not what we want to do. So these are the areas we're going to cover. This is sort of our a bit of our roadmap on how to make your garden resilient. So the first thing is what you're actually doing here. You're educating yourself. So learn about what makes your garden resilient. Come to classes, read books, watch YouTubes, talk to people who are seasoned gardeners. Go work in a community garden among other people where you can learn shoulder to shoulder and see what works and what doesn't work. Prevention, we just talked about that. Having your healthy soil, using the right kind of plants in the right places, paying attention to stressors, that sort of thing. We'll go through that. And then identifying identifying exactly what the problem is. Whoops. Sorry about that. Evaluate. So once you identify, then you want to evaluate the situation. And then, after you've done all these steps, then you can take some action. A lot of people just see a problem, jump right into action without really looking through what's going on. And then, after taking action, you're going to want to monitor. And then it starts all over again, right? You see something, you're not sure what it is, you need to educate yourself, and you can come back down through the list. So educate. I love this quote from Gertrude Jekyll. She lived a very long time. She was a horticulturist in England. And she said, a garden is a grand teacher. It teaches patience and careful watchfulness. I love that word, watchfulness. That's a good word for the garden. And it teaches industry and thrift. All these old-timey words that really have so much power in them, right? Garden is a grand teacher. One of the things I like to tell people, and we've been working on the community garden out here, which we'll talk about, and then maybe at the end you'll go out and walk around, because we utilized all the principles that we've been teaching in these classes when we planted it. But one of the most important things is being in the garden. Being observant in the garden. I love to take a cup of tea out to the garden and just walk the garden. See what's happening. See what's sprouted. See what might be fruiting. Maybe see a problem at the very beginning. You know, you might turn a leaf over and see, oh, there's some eggs there. And you can get it before the pest hatches. You can see if the garden is too wet or too dry. You could just observe a lot of things in the garden. Plus, you can just take in all the beauty and all the wonder of growing things that you know is going to sustain you. I think that's, I say just being in the garden is every bit as important as actually digging in the soil. So learning how to grow a healthy garden. We talked about the importance of healthy soil. I can't stress that enough. If you feed the soil, the plants will take care of themselves. And one of the most important things is to get a soil test, and I encourage you to do that now that you're just newly here and just starting, is get some soil tests done. Because how would you know what to do if you don't know what it needs? And you can get tests through the Cooperative Extension Service, and there's good instructions on it, and then they'll send you back a really wonderful report that will give you an idea of not only what it might be missing as far as nutrients, but also the makeup of the soil. You'll be able to see how much organic matter there is and various things like that. And taking care of the soil. One way to take care of the soil is to mulch. So there's lots of different ways you can mulch. You can use straw. We used straw out here. Some people use wood chips. That's also a good way. It's a little harder like in raised beds. We don't have raised beds at home, so we do use wood chips at home. You can use living mulch. So you can use some sort of a ground cover plant. Like in the pots that are out here, we're going to be using, instead of using straw in the pots, we're going to be using alyssum, which is also a wonderful pollinator plant that brings the bees in, and it creates this beautiful sort of carpet. So if you put, 3 or 4 of them in a small pot, you're going to have ground cover from a plant rather than having some other kind of suppressor in there. Beneficial insects and plants. So we just talked about the alyssum, which also brings in the wonderful little hoverflies. They love to come into the alyssum. They're very good for pollinating. So pay attention to bringing in beneficial insects, growing things that attract them. You'll want things like certain kinds of wasps in the garden are really good. Ladybugs are really good. Of course, you're going to want your all the different kinds of bees, and not just the European honeybees, but the native bees. There's a lot of native bees out here, which is really wonderful. So one of the things we did when we were doing this garden is there's an old kale plant from last year that, you know, it's pretty tall. It's probably that tall. And somebody said, "Oh, we're going to take that out?" And I said, "Oh no, it's full of flowers. And it's one thing that really brings the bees in." So we just left it in the garden. We'll leave it there until it's done flowering, and it'll be done flowering pretty soon because there's already a lot of seed pods. And we'll take that out before those seeds disperse into the garden. But pay attention to things like that because you can just utilize what might be there from last year. Buying pest-resistant species. So if you don't know what those are, and they're often sort of regional. There's certain things that work well in some regions that don't work well in other regions. Go to a really good nursery and talk with them. We have some great nurseries here. We have Farmfield Nursery, which is really good. We have Salmon Falls Nursery, which is also very good, and Wentworth, is that right? Wentworth Gardens? Am I right? They're very helpful there. So you can also do a lot of research online, but I think nursery folk really like to answer questions, and most of them are educated. You go to the big box store, you're not going to get answers, and you don't want the plants from there. Those 3 nurseries I spoke of do not use neonicotinoids. I have talked with them, and they have assured me that none of them use neonicotinoids, and if you don't know what that is, that's a very horrible systemic pesticide that is widely used in big box store flowers and some of the big growers. Even some of the, I contacted a bunch of the nurseries, and even some of them I was so surprised said, "Oh, well, we don't know, we get it from a supplier." And I called the suppliers and they said, "Oh yeah, we use it." So I have a list of the nurseries that don't use them if you're interested in that. Native versus invasive species. So this is a big topic, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but you're pretty safe if you go with native species on your perennials and your shrubs and your trees. It's a big thing because people really like their cultivars. They like the fancy flowers. And it's okay to have a few of those because, you know, we like our pretty flowers. But you'll be much more successful if you plant native species because they're the species that the insects have grown up with. And they have a synergy between them. And they don't always like the fancy flowers because often the fancy flowers are really full. They can't get down in to do the pollination. So you can have a few of those, but if you focus on the native species, your garden overall will be much more healthy. Garden space requirements. So this is something that we talked about in our last class about what plants where, because there are certain things that plants like and certain things plants don't like. Shade and sun is one of them. Wet and dry is another. So you need to pay attention to what those kind of plants like and plant them in the right areas, because if you plant a plant in the wrong area and it gets overstressed, when a plant gets overstressed, just like us, what happens? We're much more apt to get sick. We get weak, and pests are opportunistic. They're going to come in and do what they do. So pay attention to those requirements. And water and mulch is the last in this section. So water. Water is one of those things that we can use way too much of. So use your finger, stick your finger down into the soil, you know, up to here, and feel. Is it wet down in there? If it's wet down in there, you don't need to water. If it's wet just a little bit, then you probably do, because the roots are down there, right? So you don't have to go buy any fancy equipment. You've got it right here. And mulching, we talked about before. Mulching is so important because the soil is just like your skin. You don't want your skin to always be exposed outside. You know what happens? You get a sunburn. It hurts. It dries the skin out. It cracks the skin. It does the very same thing on the soil. So if you're covering the soil, you're protecting that wonderful ecosystem that your plants are living in. If you don't, you're just basically abusing those plants and the soil. Okay, Dennis is going to talk about what pests are.
Right. So, one definition of a pest is an organism that's detrimental to humans and destroys crops and structures, poses a threat to human health, livestock, and reduces aesthetic and recreational values. Another definition of pests is, gee, I don't like that. You know, so, yeah, just keeping in mind what is a pest, because maybe some things that this formal definition calls a pest isn't really a pest for you. You're recognizing this is part of my garden ecosystem, and this is playing some kind of role. And, oh, wrong way, huh?
Right.
There you go. All right, so you got 4 basic categories of what kind of pests they might be. It might be weeds, might be invertebrates, might be a vertebrate, it might be a plant disease. So here's another definition. What's a weed? Some people say it's a plant that's out of place. And other people might say it's something that's undesirable, plant that's undesirable. And federal government might say something along the lines that it causes agricultural industry some kind of problem. So like out west, we just moved from Oregon a year and a half or so ago. Out there in our area, they had a yellow star thistle. Quite the weed. It has a nice little yellow flower on it, and maybe gets about this high, and then it dries out. It's full of thorns. It's like really hard just to walk through, and it's a real problem for livestock growers. So that's a classic U.S. government weed. And it's highly invasive. It'll just spread, and I think it comes from the steppes of Asia, if I remember right. Oh, so here we got our invertebrates. This isn't quite all of the invertebrates. I don't see any slugs in there. But gives you a good representation of what we mean by invertebrates, things that don't have a spine. Some of these are friendly, some of them are not. And then here's our typical vertebrates that you find around here. Some of them might not be to your liking. Some of them might be okay. You know, but a lot of them you can keep out of the garden by just a fence or other barrier. Okay, and plant diseases, that's a little harder, like the fungal diseases. Well, you have to rely on what's happening, what you can see to really identify a fungus. You know, you need a lot of education and a lot of equipment like good microscopes, but by looking at the damage being done, you can kind of classify whether it's a mold or a rust or a mildew, and that visually you can see it, what's happening. And the University of Maine has a plant disease laboratory, and if you have something that you can't identify yourself, you can take a picture of it and email it to them and give them a description of what you see, and they'll look at it and identify it for you if possible. You know, it's maybe some things they might not be able to separate out, but they could give you a general idea. And in some cases they want to actually have a specimen of the plant material, but for a home gardener I think that's kind of an excessive approach, you know. And then you got the bacterial diseases and viral diseases. And then you know, that the phytoplasma, it's not on this slide, we got it coming up. I think go back. Here, and the last word there, phytoplasm. So I forgot to talk about that. That's sort of like a bacteria, but it's lost cell membrane and the nucleus. And what often happens is that an insect will have it inside of it, and it'll, when it's feeding on a plant, it'll get transferred into the plant, and it lives in the phloem, essentially the blood vessels of the plant, right? And it lives in there, and it can destroy the plant. It'll like create blockages in the flow of nutrients in the plant, or do other damage. It depends on exactly what variety it is. So here's where an insect is passing this phytoplasm around, and so one way of controlling it is finding out what insect is the vector and controlling the vector. And then some viral diseases are also passed by insects into a plant. So learning something about each of these kinds of problems will help you recognize things more quickly. It's, you know, somewhat difficult to, when you're just starting off and you haven't had any experience of separating out bacterial, fungal, and viral problems. But with little time and effort, and maybe taking pictures and comparing it online or sending it into the plant disease laboratory, you'll soon start seeing how they all fit together.
We had an issue of that this spring. Well, we still have the issue with one of our plum trees. There was a lot of rain, and the tree has really long, kind of wispy branches that sort of got overloaded with water. And we had already trimmed in the spring, pruned in the spring, but we noticed these cankers on the bark. So Dennis took lots of great pictures. He sent it in. We got a report back. We don't know if we're going to lose the tree or not, but we have the information that we need, because all we could see was the damage, and we knew, oh, there's something going on with this tree, and it's just, you know, it's its second year, so.
Yeah, so this is called black knot canker, and so it's a fungi, and when it first starts off, it's just little bumps on the bark, and it's very indistinguishable. It's quite easy to miss it. But in the kind of spring we've been having with somewhat warm and wet, it goes through its cycle and starts putting out spores. And when we first noticed it, you know, a lot of the little cankers were maybe so long, and it looks sort of like basket weaving around the outside of the plant. The stems, and some of them were just on the top, some of them were on the side, and some were all the way around. And now, after we've had additional rain and warmth, you can see this black, velvety fungal spores coating the kind of the basket weave that it made before. You know, and it's like, you know, it's like, how do you deal with it? You know, the link they sent talks about pruning it in winter, and I'm going, well, by the time winter comes, there's not going to be anything left. But if you go out and prune right now, there's a good chance those spores are in the environment. Even if you try to keep your equipment clean when you make the cut, it'll get infected by the spores that are just in the air. You know, it's like, oh, yeah, difficult one. All right, so we talked about before about weeds, about plant causing economic losses and ecological damage and health problems for humans and animals. Or back to that informal definition, it's not desirable where it's growing. That's the plant out of place idea. But the ecological damage, like, you know, in Louisiana, kudzu is like practically taken over the entire state, and a lot of other places that English ivy is all over the place, you know. And we have several invasive species around here, bittersweet and knotweed and I think there's Virginia creeper. Virginia creeper, that's the one I was trying to remember. An noxious weed is like that yellow star thistle I was talking about. That's a real problematic thing. So it's recognized to be able to cause problems for public health and agriculture and recreation. You know, and an invasive weed is one that really spreads. You know, like good old knotweed. Really takes over areas really fast, and it emits chemicals from its roots and thereby retarding the growth of other plant species near it. So it forms monocultural patches, and it readily sprouts from rhizomes. So if you just try to rip it out of the ground, you just break it and leave a bunch of plants, future plants behind. Yeah, so that's real difficult. Oh.
So we're going to talk about a term called IPM, which just stands for Integrated Pest Management. You'll often hear this term having to do with towns. A lot of towns have integrated pest management programs. So that, well, as you'll see as we go along, basically IPM is a roadmap for how to take care of pests. They can be anything from household pests, cockroaches, rats, things like that, or in your garden, and you might have issues with rats in your garden. I hope you don't. But it's basically a roadmap. So it's a scientifically based system of pest control that uses different techniques. And it has this pyramid, which we will look at in a minute, so you start at the bottom, you try all the things at the bottom first. If that doesn't work, then you work your way up to the very last. But the most important thing is, when you're looking at pests, is to learn the life cycle of the pests. So you might be having a real problem with potato bugs in your garden, in your potatoes, but if you had planted the potatoes even a month later, the potato bugs wouldn't bother it because they're already past. I just learned that today. I did not know that. So I'm glad I haven't planted my potatoes yet. They're hardening. What's the term for potatoes when you're getting scarring, right? When it grows over, I think that's what it's called. So you don't want it to be wet when you put it in the ground. It has to scar over a little bit. So mine are doing that now. So I was really glad to learn that it's good to wait. It's not always good to put your garden in just as soon as you can, especially this year with the weather the way it's been. And see how the pests interact with the environment. So observe. We've talked about that. Just observe. So some people like to really rush in if they see aphids. Oh, I have to spray them with something. I have to do something. Well, maybe the ladybugs haven't shown up yet. Ladybugs love aphids. So you just have to pay attention to the life cycles and how they interact. Working with how to, I mean, you certainly don't want aphids to kill your plant. So if the ladybugs haven't shown up, one of the best ways for aphids is just a good spray from the hose. You don't have to use soap. You don't have to use other things. Just knock them off. Because once they hit the ground, they aren't going to come back up. And you want to, obviously, you don't want the health affected of your plants or the people around them. So if you see something that's really noxious, you need to look at it right away. So here's just a little quick graphic to show you sort of the roadmap of an IPM. And you don't need to read all these little words here because you have them, most of them in your notes. So this does things in a little bit of a different order than what I think is important. This has prevention as number 3. I think prevention is number 1. Start with prevention. But you want to identify what the pest is and how it's affecting your garden. That's just as important as figuring out what it is, figuring out what it's doing. And then evaluating. So evaluating the issue. Evaluating what your threshold is, right? What's your threshold for that pest? Maybe you don't care. Maybe you don't care that it's aphids. Maybe it's on a plant that you don't even care about. You don't have to rush in and spray it with something if it's on a plant that you don't even care about. So evaluating your threshold of what you can tolerate. Maybe you watch the aphids for a day or so, and then maybe you come out the next morning and there's the ladybug. And then you also want to evaluate whatever action you took later. So there's 3 different ways to evaluate. We're going to talk about that. I think that's actually on a slide. And then taking some sort of action, but not until you have done all the other things first. And then monitoring. And then we start all over again. Okay, back to prevention. That's number 2. Educate was number 1. Prevention. We kind of went through these. Number 1, take care of your soil. Build your soil. Love your soil. If you take really good care of your soil, the soil is going to take care of the plants. Right plants, right location. We went through that. Make sure you know what kind of environment a plant likes. Some plants don't really care. They can take sun, they can take shade, they can take wet, they can take dry, but some are very specific. Some plants really do not thrive in the sun. Buy healthy plants. Okay, you might make a scene at the nursery, and I don't care. Take the plant out of the pot and look at it. If those are all wrapped around and you couldn't possibly, leave it there. You want plants that have really lovely, lush, new roots. Now, some things it wouldn't matter as much. And as you become more of a seasoned gardener, you'll go, yeah, I can deal with that. And if it is somewhat root bound, when you get it home and you go to put it in the soil, you know that you tickle the roots, right? Take it out of the pot before you put it into the ground. You tickle the roots so that it sort of loosens them up a little bit. Give them a little massage, right? Yeah, but if it's all wound, the worst thing is when they're wound around the pot. That is called pot bound, and you don't want that. You wouldn't put up with that in your house plants. You'd be transplanting them into a bigger pot. Same thing. Select insect and disease resistant plants. We talked about that. Those can be regional, and you just have to do your research or talk to somebody at a nursery. Practice crop rotation. That's a really important thing because you need new environments for things. If you put the corn in the same place every year, it's going to start to give you much less produce. So rotate things around. I always graph things out. I like to play with pictures, so it's fun for me. But I think it's really useful to look at and keep notes from the year before. Where did I put that last year? If you can remember it, great. But a lot of us can't really remember, well, where did I have that last year? And to switch things around. You know, even if it's just 1 year, just switch things around. Choose optimal planting times. Here's a good example. You don't put your tomatoes in the ground until the ground is about 60 degrees. If you do, that tomato is just going to sit there because tomatoes like it hot. It's just going to sit there. It's going to sit there in cold soil. And if it's anything like me, if I had to sit there in cold soil, I would not be happy. And so it stresses the plant. So then by the time the soil gets warm, the plant's already stressed. And the pests go, oh, there's a stressed plant. I can do something there. So pay attention to the optimal planting times. And that information is out there. You just have to educate yourself and find out what's the best time. Of course, it's a little tricky. We've had such a weird year. You know, normally by now it would be, like just today I measured our soil temperature. It was 62 degrees today. So it's finally at a place where it's okay to put the tomatoes in. Well, a lot of people have their tomatoes in already, a long time ago. Plant with proper spacing. So I'm guilty of scrunching too many things into one place. I like that. But you can also take some of the lower leaves off so there's a little airflow. That's the biggest issue, which can also lead to powdery mildew and various other things. But I would say as a new gardener, for sure, pay attention to proper spacing. As time goes on, you'll learn where you can morph things a little bit. But remove ripe or damaged produce. So that's important. If you leave produce on the vine, on the plant, and it starts to go rotten, well, what's nature going to do? It's going to send in the things that are going to eat that rotten fruit. So if you take it out of the garden or out of the space where that plant is, maybe you have a composty area in that same garden, but don't leave it there underneath the plant because you're just asking for problems. Slugs and wasps and yellow jackets and things will come in. Water in the morning. I see lots of people watering at night after work. It's not the best because then the water sits overnight when it's cooler and you can have a lot more problems with pests and with water damage and soil being too moist at night. Inspect your plants. So that's what I was talking about, going out in the morning. Go out in the morning and look at your plants. Take off those dead leaves, deadhead your marigolds and your other things that are in your garden. Just look under the leaves. Don't just look at the top of the leaves. Look under the leaves, because that's often where the eggs are for insects, is underneath the leaves. And mulch. Mulch, mulch, mulch. Come on. You're up.
So step 3, identify. So always investigate and identify the pest first, and then identify the damage. So if you go out and you see a bunch of damaged leaves, and you happen to see something on the leaf, you might jump to conclusion, culprit. But maybe the real culprit came at night when you weren't there and ate the leaves, and these other guys are just passing by, and you got guilt by association instead of by fact, you know. So that's another thing, is that there's insects that are active at night. So sometimes the best way is taking your flashlight and going out in the middle of the night and checking underneath the leaves and seeing what's there. Maybe you'd be lucky. Maybe you just have daytime insects in your garden, you know. And then, you know, if you tried several things like going out at night or during different times of day, like morning or evening, it's probably a lot better to look for insects than the heat of the day. But if you can never find the actual insect that's causing the problem on the plant, you should examine the damage, and then you should also like, well, what's it going on? What plant is it on? Because there's some insects that concentrate on just one plant, one type of plant, or maybe a plant family. So maybe all your brassicas might be subject to a certain kind of pests that they don't bother, like the onions, you know. So you can, where the damage is, what kind of plant it is, what part of the plant it is, whether it's along the leaf margin or in the center of the leaf or it's somewhere else. You can then start being able to formulate questions that ask maybe the plant disease or pest lab, or looking on Mr. Google and seeing what they got to say about these things. Or maybe something really ancient, like a book. You know, maybe one of these library books, maybe even. There have been some really wonderful gardener-centered bug books over the years, and so that's a really good place to start, because you can quickly look at the nice colored pictures and maybe find out what's going on without a lot of effort. You know, and then, is the pest the problem, or is it something else? So at the same time we had trouble with that plum tree this year, our Honeycrisp apple had these long lesions on the branches and a little bit on the stem. It's only a 2-year-old plant. So we sent those pictures off to the lab, and they go, oh, that's cold damage. You know, new plant. We had some nice cold spells this year, but just enough to damage that young material. And so I could have been going down the wrong road of going, bacterial disease, gotta get it, oh my God. Nope, it turned out cold. So sometimes what you're looking at isn't even a pest problem, it's an environmental problem. So you got to take that in, you know, skipping down to the last line on the slide there, that plant damage may be to cold or hot weather or insufficient light. Or sometimes like you have something planted against a west wall, and by virtue of it being in front of the west wall, it gets too hot there for that plant. Maybe other times a year, a different plant would really love the extra heat, you know, extend your season, but maybe in the dead of summer, that west wall is the death knell for that particular plant. So, and then another thing that could be going on is the soil isn't providing the nutrition that that plant needs. So sometimes a plant can have signs that might mislead you into thinking that it's a bacteria or fungal disease or something. But I think that's a little bit more rare, but it's still a possibility to keep in mind. And it's really important that when you're dealing with pests, especially insect pests, recognize that insects go through life stages called instars. So the butterfly isn't always a butterfly. Sometimes it's a caterpillar, you know, and sometimes it's a little pupa. And so to go through these different stages, and at different stages have different food requirements. So, you know, if you're into growing prize milkweed, maybe monarch butterflies are a problem, but but only the caterpillars, the butterflies themselves aren't the problem, right? So, all right. So, got to start off in how you're going to identify the pest. Well, first, I hope you've ruled out that it's not environmental damage. And then, what does the pest look like? It's the shape, the coloration, the leg count, wings, other physical attributes, because that's how taxonomy separates the different categories of insects, you know. Some things are, you know, like spiders are 8-legged, but insects like beetles are 6-legged. So it starts telling you already what kind of insect, or at least what large group of insect you're looking at. The same with the number of wing counts. Some have just a pair, some have sets of 2 pairs. Somehow the wings fold. Like a leafhopper, the wings fold up and they look like a roof on top of the insect, where other ones they lay flat. So they're diagnostic things of how the insect presents will help you quickly find it. And again, we talked about the kind of damage that's doing, and whether that's on a particular part of the plant, what kind of plant, so forth. You know, and that's the host plant. So, like we said before, if you have particular insect-plant relationships, that'll help you find out quickly what's going on. And then seek help from the Extension Service, online sources, books, and master gardeners. So the Extension Service trains people to become master gardeners. And they also have the disease and insect pest lab up in at the main university, and you can send them digital information and descriptions of what's going on, and they'll help you figure it out. Let's see. that one? Yeah, so with so this is one of the major steps of an IPM, or Integrated Pest Management, our roadmap for dealing with pests in the garden, right? So, like, going back to the very first thing, what's happening? After your morning walk in the garden, what did that reveal? Is there a problem? Do you have a insect outbreak all of a sudden one morning? Was it on plants that are really important to you? Is that your prized bouquet plants there? You know, that's really important. Or is it something of marginal interest? Where are you? Not everything you grow in the garden, I bet, has the same value to you. So keep that in mind. And then, you know, you might just have past experience and know that you can deal with the problem, and so you don't have to get it really upset about seeing a few insects, right? And then after you figure out what to do, then it's also time to, after you actually take the action, keep looking for a few days and see if it took care of it. Because, you know, sometimes it doesn't take care of it. And for some of these problems, it might be because it was a hard problem to identify. Like, you've decided it was a bacterial disease when it actually turned out to be a viral disease, and what you need to do is slightly different, and it just wasn't effective. So, got to keep paying attention of what's going on. And it's not necessarily the case that you've gone and applied your remedy and it worked out.
Here's our best advice. Respond, don't react. Remember that really everything in the garden is some amount of experiment. It's not the end of the world. You're learning from it. One of the great ways to plant your garden is to not plant everything in the same place. Don't put all of your tomatoes together. Don't put all of your brassicas in one place. Put some here, put some over there, because that way, if you have an issue, it's not going to, if it's a bad issue, it's not going to wipe out the whole thing, because they might just be really localized. So if you have them in two places, chances are these will be okay. I mean, it could be, but if you're paying attention, you're going to probably catch the first one and take care of it. So taking action. As we've said before, a caterpillar becomes a butterfly or a moth, and those are food for baby birds. So each clutch, let's say, of chickadees, they need thousands of caterpillars for that one clutch. So if somebody gets all wiggy about, oh my gosh, I've got caterpillars, I got to kill them. Remember, if you kill them, that's taking food out of a baby bird's mouth. So you have to weigh your decision about what you're going to do. And a vole or a mole is food for an owl. So maybe you have a vole or a mole problem. You could put up some owl boxes. Mosquitoes are foods for bats and frogs and hummingbirds. 80% of a hummingbird's diet is insects. We think of it as the nectar, but 80% of their diet is insects. They move so fast it's hard to see, but if you really pay attention and watch them, they'll be flying along and hover a little bit. They're getting insects then. And aphids are foods for ladybugs. And worms and grubs are food for birds and skunks. So you have to think about, when you take an action, what the consequences are of that action. Is it really a pest? Or can you live together?
All right, well, this little cartoon characterizes the central theme of an IPM, or this roadmap that we've been laying out to you, is what's the risk involved in the practice that you're going to employ, so that there's we're trying to lay out a way of looking at taking the things that have the lowest risk and doing those first, and then working through other solutions if the first one doesn't do it for you. So, you know, in like risk management is taking steps to minimize the chance of things going wrong. So here, when you've got you know, you're out to spray pesticides, maybe everything will go right and you'll get exactly what you want and coated just enough and not too much. But maybe just as you're spraying it, it'll suddenly gust of wind comes up and that pesticide's carried over and hits things that you don't want it falling on. So the use of pesticides is inherently a high-risk operation. And maybe it's justified, but you know, it's only justified if the risk involved is evaluated, and if things going badly are considered. You know, you can't assume that just because you're going to take an action, everything's going to go correctly. So just a consideration. So here's the pyramid that Amrita mentioned earlier. Said so that as you go up the pyramid, the risk gets higher, and it becomes a stronger intervention. So down below, with cultural practices like soil health, crop rotation, you know, one of the crop rotation principles is that over time, like bacteria or viral diseases or nematodes will develop in the soil. And if you keep planting the same thing there, then sooner or later those disease organisms are going to infect the plant. So you keep moving things around, and then the soil food web will go, oh, look, there's a potato mosaic virus. I'll just eat that for lunch. You know? And then you got the mulch, and mulch is really good because it keeps the moisture in the soil and keeps the soil cool. And by keeping the soil cool, it doesn't kill off all the microorganisms that provide the web of life in the soil. And then weed management. So some weeds are hosts to insects that can be really problematic in your garden. So not every weed has got a mega insect associated that's going to wipe you out, but you know, there are a few that do. So knowing what kind of pests live on what kind of weeds is an important step in your garden management, right? There's a lot of weeds you can go, Oh, no big deal. Dandelion, I love them, drawing those bees. Okay, and then the interplanting, so that like along with crop rotation is like you have these different plants, and so they're not all the same kind of plant, and so it doesn't encourage the formation of a lot of bacterial problems or a lot of viral problems, that there's a mix, a diversity. And plant roots are amazing. They play an important role in maintaining the soil ecosystem. They exude chemicals, basically sugars, and a few other things, then that feed bacteria and fungi near the roots of the plant, and those fungi and the bacteria help feed the plant, especially the fungi. They develop little hyphal networks, mycelium, and they can really expand the amount of area that's providing nutrition to the plant, far more than the roots of the plant can do. And so they can, and in some plants, like I was mentioning, like knotweed, they can actually exude chemicals that are harmful to other plant species. But so just that interplanting helps the diversity of the root zone, which helps the diversity of the soil microbiome and provides a healthier situation. And then you got your physical and mechanical things like tarps, like floating road cover. Or traps. I was thinking tarps in terms of road cover, but traps, you know, so you got your mammals coming in, your voles and whatnot, and you might want to trap them. Or even some of the insect traps, where you, some insect traps are used to actually capture the insect, but some are also used just to show the presence or absence of that kind of insect, so that you know whether they're, you know, like they might be a nighttime insect, and it's easier to find out by just putting a trap out. And then going out and inspecting the leaves, and maybe just hand picking them. Oh, there's a little cluster of eggs. Maybe I can just sacrifice that leaf and take that leaf out of there and dispose of it if I know that those eggs are coming from a particular insect. You don't want to just randomly do that because, oh, those were the ladybug eggs. Oh, oops. And then pruning, you know, so you get some, maybe the start of bacterial disease on a fruit tree, and you can do a little pruning and get rid of it before it spreads to the whole tree. And then water spray for aphids. And then the biological. Well, the biological and the cultural are kind of interconnected, because the cultural provides the kind of a base for the biology to happen in. Good soil management leads to good, healthy soil, which has got bacteria and soil insects and nematodes in it, and supports healthy plants. And you can also, good beneficial insects like the ladybugs eating the aphids. And then sometimes maybe you feel you have an outbreak that deserves a little stronger response, and so maybe making up a vinegar or boric acid solution, a little soap to help it spread out on the plant leaf, or repellents or oils like fruit trees. You know, it's hard to grow fruit trees without using dormant oil spray or something equivalent to it to control the fungal and bacterial diseases that can develop in spring if they're not dealt with in the wintertime with a dormant oil spray of some kind. And then the very last and most risky thing is some level of pesticides, and some things that are natural pesticides are still dangerous. Like, you know, just, it's not a garden example, but like hemlock. Hemlock was good enough to get rid of a problematic philosopher in ancient Greece. You know, it's just not, you know, it is a strong poison. So, well, rhodotone, that's the one I was trying to think of, is a plant-derived pesticide, but it definitely has risks associated with it. All right.
Okay, now we're back to monitoring again. So, you've done your educating, you've done your prevention, you've identified, you evaluated, you made some sort of intervention, or not, maybe. Then you come to monitoring. So here we are back again. So you want to look at your plants again. See if you have new areas. Let me just give you an example of something I saw last week, I think it was. Our little witch hazel tree, which is only about this big, had holes in the leaves. Now, I couldn't see any insect. I don't know when it happened. I don't know who got it. But a really good deterrent to insects is onions, or something in the onion family, always. So I like to plant alliums anywhere I can. Any kind of onions, any kind of garlic, garlic chives. So I had a little 6-pack of onions that I got at the nursery, and I was really busy doing other things, and I just took that 6-pack and I stuck it at the bottom of that little shrub. And it's still there. I still haven't planted the onions, but it did the trick. There's no more holes. So sometimes it can be something just that simple. I'm aware of the time, so we won't go through all of this, but it's pretty straightforward. Look at the plant itself. Is it wilting more? Is it discolored? Does it have sunken areas? Is there rot on it? Is the plant stunted? Is the growth stunted? It might be a problem down in the roots. You know, you might have put hot compost down in there and didn't realize it. I mean, that can happen. We did that last year by mistake. We were in such a hurry, right? Oh, well, it'll be fine. No, it wasn't. Things kind of just stood there for like months. Oh, this is too hot. And then finally, after a few months, they got strong again and then took off. But we really stressed them out at the beginning. But this is what happens. You learn. You make mistakes all the time, and you just learn from them. How many pests are there per plant, and what percentage of the plant is being affected by whatever the pest is? And it's always interesting to see what the beneficial insects are that are there. Maybe they're taking care of the issue. And again, the moisture is wet and dry, wet and dry. So that's our presentation. There are no hard and fast rules. This for that, maybe, but that is not always that. It's that plus that, or that minus that, or that and some other that together. So just learn to respond and not to react, because that reaction has consequences. We have a friend in Oregon where we lived that received third-degree burns on her face from a neighbor who was spraying Roundup down below, and she had no idea that he was doing that, and she had got these severe burns on her face, and she went, I think, to the emergency room, and they said, well, this looks like a chemical burn. And then she found out that he had been using Roundup. So, you know, he was using it on his property, but perhaps inappropriately, we don't know, but you know, it affected not just her, but it affected her yard as well. So we just really have to think beyond ourselves, right? This is a good rule in life. Think about what the consequences are of our actions. Any questions?
Where did you say they get the soil tests from?
Do you want to speak to that?
Over in Sanford, there's an extension office, and they have the soil test packets over there. Or you can contact the soil lab at the University of Maine. You can go online and send them an email, and they'll mail you the soil test information.
It takes about 10 days or so. Well, it might be less this time of year. I don't know.
Oh,
This is busier now?
busier. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so what they'll do is they have you go out and take soil from several different places and then mix it together, and then you get a little clump about that big and label it and mail it to them, and then they look at it, and then on the form you send in, you can check to have your the report sent to your email, and then you also get one in the mail.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, good. Thank you.